You ever feel lonely? What if loneliness was telling you something? Mother Teresa said that loneliness is like the leprosy of our day. But what if you are not made to be lonely? What if you are made to be a friend? To be a friend of God? I can remember when I was a sophomore in high school and I made my first really close friend. His name was Chuck, and I didn't realize until we became best friends how lonely I had been without a friend of my own. One of the great phrases in the Bible that describes certain people is to say that they are a friend of God. What if you were made not to be lonely, but to be a friend of God? What if this is the secret behind the deep peace and joy of Jesus? It's a funny thing about Jesus. He was often alone. He was never lonely. We are often lonely, but we are rarely alone. In these next moments, Dallas Willard is going to walk together with us through the great invitation of life, and that is to live in intimate friendship with God, to never again be alone.
Spiritual transformation into Christ-likeness comes through a process, and that process is one of living in relationship to God. How are we to live in that relationship? What is our part? What God does? And how that makes us able to become increasingly like our heart says we should be, and like God wants us to be. So we're addressing this question in connection with the phrase hearing God, but hearing God is simply a short way of talking about a conversational relationship with God. And we want to try to say as clearly as we can what that is like so that we can live in it to the greatest advantage of our spiritual growth in Christ-likeness. It's very touching to observe how God approaches us. One of the most heartwarming scriptures to me is the picture in Genesis 3, where it talks about Adam and Eve heard the sound of God walking in the garden. You have to pause a moment to think about what that tells you about God. God walking in the garden. What was he doing? Well, he was enjoying his creation, and he was coming to visit. Now, God, as he shows up in the early chapters of Genesis, turns out to be a very chatty God. You'll remember that even after Cain began to get in trouble, God shows up essentially for a counseling session and says, now, Cain, what's the problem? You can do it. It's true, sin is crouching at the door, and it would like to have you. But you can overcome it. Come on, Cain. And that interaction is very interesting also, because do you think he could have stopped Cain from killing Abel? You see, what emerges here is not only God's interest in our lives, but the space that he gives us. He does not stand over us. He gives us opportunity to work and be on our own. He gave Adam and Eve distance, but he came to visit. And I don't know how you handle that question. Adam, where are you? But you might try thinking that by his choice, God didn't know where Adam was. Now, don't get too worked up about what he could know. There's no doubt that if he had wanted to know, he could know where Adam was. But he gave Adam the distance that allowed him to respond to the question. And when we come to think about the basic relationship of intimate fellowship, friendship with God, we want to understand that it is one where God is both available, but gives us the option of turning away. And practically speaking now, for our studies together here, we need to come to grips with that option and think about how it is exercised. God comes, God walks in our midst. He's there. As Jesus said, the kingdom of heaven is in your midst. The kingdom of God is in your midst. The kingdom of God is just God acting. He's everywhere. But you don't always see him. And yet he does show up. And he gives us these wonderful words like the great Aaronic blessing in Deuteronomy 6. He told Moses, God told Aaron through Moses, that Aaron should put this blessing upon his people. Now, just think about the words. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you. And don't go too fast by there. You have to think about what that meant. The shining face of God. The face of God shining on you. Isn't that a wonderful picture? The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. I especially like the phrase, the Lord lift up his countenance upon you. As a child, I couldn't make much sense of lifting up your countenance. What it means is the Lord look right at you. The Lord look right at you. Lift up his countenance upon you. The Lord be gracious. See, that's presence. And that's what God has made us for, is his presence. And he seeks fellowship with us. God seeks fellowship with us. What does that come from? That comes from his nature as loving community. That is the basic nature of God, and we shall have to talk later about the Trinity, because the Trinity is not just a dry as dust old doctrine. It is a picture of the living reality of God and the community of God. But then there's our response. What is our response? Well, the psalmist says in Psalm 27, when you said, seek my face, I said, thy face, O Lord, will I seek. That's our side. And so there is an area here where we realize that our relationship to God is not a consumerist relationship. Religion, as Christianity understands it, isn't a consumer relation. We don't consume the merits of Christ. We don't consume the services of the church. We are participants. We are not spectators. We are in the game. And the game is producing the greatest creative goodness possible under the power and character of God in which we share. We find that God is not just a creator, he creates creators, and that's you and me. We were meant to live in a fellowship that is, at least for the beginning, to be described as a conversational relationship with God. There's some wonderful words from Brother Lawrence. there is not in the world a kind of life more sweet and delightful than that of a continual conversation with God. Those only can comprehend it who practice and experience it. Yet I do not advise you to do it from that motive. It is not pleasure that we ought to seek in this exercise, but let us do it from a principle of love and because God would have us do it. Our part, our response, is to speak to God and listen to God in a conversational relationship. We seek His face, but we don't just seek it to look at. We seek it to interact. And that interaction is primarily one of speaking and of hearing. And we have these great verses that show up and get quoted very often, like, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves. That's how you come before God. And that's why we don't seek it just for fun and pleasure, because it isn't for our use to get what we want. We humble ourselves. That really means to see ourselves realistically before God, as dependent upon His goodness and as an expression of His goodness. The verse there in 2 Chronicles says, if my people, not everyone, my people, who are those, the ones who are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray, seek my face, turn from their wicked ways, then I will come. I will remove the distance. I will come, I will hear them, I will forgive them, I will heal. And so where we start from is a position of alienation. That's the natural condition of humankind. But we are invited to live before the shining face of God, and in that place to live out a conversation where we speak and we hear. And that is the place of the friend. The 23rd Psalm says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Why? Because God is with me. That with God is the key to understanding who we are and why we are here, and the nature of the relationship that we have with God. Brother Lawrence tells us to practice the presence of God. He wasn't the first to say that, but he did it probably in the best way that we are all familiar with. Others, like there's a little book called The Way of the Pilgrim, where a serious person decides they want to learn how to pray without ceasing. And the technique that they learned comes down to us in the form of what we call the Jesus prayer, which is a repetition of Jesus, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Now, you don't have to use exactly those words, but what he was learning was how to keep a conversation running, talking to God, listening to God. Frank Laubach, another more modern figure, a great person who learned how to be with God by turning his mind once a moment in some way towards God, whether it was a verse from a hymn, an image of a saint, a prayer for a need, because that's one thing he learned how to do, was to pray moment by moment for what he needed in that moment, and he saw the remarkable answers that came in those moments for such things as, what's the next word I should type? And God, that interactive relationship was one of friendship. Now, Jesus calls us friends if we simply do what he commands. But it isn't slavishly. It is doing it as one who understands what's going on. He says in John 15, "You are my friends if you do what I command you. No longer I call you slaves or servants, for the slave does not know what his master is doing." The intimate relationship with Christ that we live in is one where we know what he's doing, and we are his friends by cooperative activity, not just because we get something that blots out our personality, pushes away our wants and our desires, but rather we live in that relationship where our desires are as important to God as his desires are important to us. Now, you may think that's a little too much, but you're living in a relationship where God not only answers your prayers, but is working around you to help you desire the right things. So it isn't just he gives you what you desire, he gives you the desires of your heart as you live in the conversational relationship with God. God's intent for each of us is that we should grow to the point to where he can empower us to do what we want. Now, there's a lot of work on our wanter before we get there. And that's what goes on in the relationship as we walk with God, listening and hearing moment by moment, day by day, as we grow.
So we're talking about this phrase that's simple but remarkable, that we could be a friend of God. That I could be a friend of God. Yes. And I think both of you actually were the ones through whom I found out about this fellow Frank Laubach, Methodist educator and missionary in the Philippines, who found that he was supposed to be doing God's work, but didn't know what does it mean to be a friend of God. And I think for a lot of people, it's a wonderful sounding phrase. And I kind of hope it means that when I die, I don't get in trouble. But what does it mean right here, right now, can be harder. And Laubach, in reading him, it was very dramatic for me because he took it so seriously. Yes. And there's that story of him being up on Signal Hill, and he was so disappointed in his life. He'd had, I think all but one of his children had died of malaria. And his wife had to be very far from him. He was not able to be president of the school that he was hoping to be president of because he lost by a single vote.
It was his vote, which was his own vote.
Yeah.
So much for nobility.
Yeah. Or stupidity. Like, vote for yourself, man. But he's up on Signal Hill, and it was so poignant to think of somebody who is seeking to serve God, and yet there's this sense of distance, estrangement. And then in the midst of that pain, and often it seems like there has to be pain, and that desperate desire to want that life with God more than you want anything else. And then for the thought to come that God really could speak to him. And then for it to come in such an interesting way, as best as I can understand it, the way that he would actually experience prayer is he would talk to God, and then he would say back what he understood God to be saying to him.
Mm-hmm. In fact, John, I have a little passage of that. He went to Signal Hill virtually every day for a year. He says in this one passage, "Just at this moment you must hear of this sacred evening. The day had been rich but strenuous, so I climbed Signal Hill, back of my house, talking and listening to God all the way up, all the way back, all the lovely half hour on top. And God talked back. I let my tongue go loose, and from it there flowed poetry far more beautiful than anything I ever composed. It flowed without pausing and without ever a failing syllable for half an hour. I listened, astonished and full of joy and gratitude. I wanted a dictaphone, for I knew that I should not be able to remember it, and now I cannot. Why, someone may ask, did God waste his poetry on you alone when you could not carry it home? You will have to ask God that question. I only know he did, and I am happy in the memory. Isn't that lovely?
But it's wonderful how out of this he learned a presence of God with him and a speaking voice that then he became this world figure.
Yeah.
Inventive of a technique for teaching people to read that is still used.
Yep.
And
Each one teach one.
each
Yep,
one
each
teach
one
one,
teach
that's
one.
right.
That's great.
And the very lovely story about how he taught one chief of the Moros to read, and the chief, out of gratitude, asked if there's anyone that he wanted him to kill, because that was one way that the Moros tribe.
It's their love language. Yeah. In fact, I think in Gary Chapman's book, that's the sixth love language. Yeah. Yeah.
But the thing is that it seems so private, and yet you can't contain it.
And it was so public. I mean, he would say, it was another little book, Learning the Vocabulary of God. He would say, that little child that can't read, is that you speaking to me, God? Which led him to this great Laubach literacy
Yeah.
work.
Yeah, and his great work came in the area of language, you see, is actually tied right into the issue of communication and intimacy that comes through that conversational relationship that he was walking into with God.
I loved his definition of a mystic, which I thought was so memorable. He said, a mystic is somebody who believes when you talk to God, God talks back.
Yes, yeah.
And it puts it so simply, because either that's the case or God doesn't talk back. And I know for me, and I think it's probably true for a lot of people, I tend to be so suspicious, put off by the abuse of God told me so language, that I would tend to go to the other extreme and close myself off from the possibility.
Yes, I think that's what most people do.
But really, even in the Bible era, I mean, Paul had to write and say, despise not prophesying. I think he had to say that because there was so much holy baloney going on.
Yeah.
That he said, now, test things. Don't despise it. Test what is true. I mean, hold fast to what is
Part of what was so helpful to me, and I think, Dallas, that you wrote about this in Hearing God. I know C.S. Lewis wrote about it. Laubach talks about, he says, the reason that there are so many human beings is God is running experiments with all of them to see how much of me can this person carry in this moment. And that thought that was so helpful to me is that communication is simply guiding somebody's thoughts.
Exactly.
That all the communication is guiding somebody's thoughts, because we're finite. We have to use finite means. We have to use sounds or written images, and then because that's happening, because I'm making these sounds, you're having thoughts that you would not otherwise have. But because God is infinite, He can guide our thoughts without needing to have any finite means in between, and that means it becomes very possible that I could be having this thought because God is guiding it. And there's still a mystery to it, but it's not so confusing then.
No.
One of the things that's so lovely, I mean, we can't be on Signal Hill and in that kind of context. But that little book he wrote, Game with Minutes, was this sort of practical way that all of us,
Yes.
and I always found it such a delight that he called it a game.
Right.
How many minutes can I be aware of God's presence? And at one point in one of his writings, he would put, these were journal writings, and at the top of the journal entry, he would put 50% conscious, 70%,
Yes.
whatever.
Wonderful.
And I used to go, conscious of what? Until he was playing his game with minutes.
But, that's one of the most encouraging thing about this, though, for those of us who think we're modern and up-to-date and all of that, is that he was an extremely well-educated person, in the social sciences especially, and in psychology, and that he would put a percentage on it.
Yeah. Try to get precise with it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, speaking of minutes, we're to our last minute. So that's it for now. I'm sorry,
This is
Dallas.
the end of the
You had a
road.
really profound thought.
No doubt it
And
was.
everybody who's watching this video is going to have to go into eternity never having heard it.
Perhaps God will talk to them.
You are an unceasing spiritual being created to live in friendship with God forever. That helps us understand the intimate relationship with God, because when we start talking about hearing God and receiving guidance and so on, we're very likely to lose the main point about friendship, and that is that communicating with God is not always or primarily a matter of being told what to do. And for many people, they cannot progress in their relationship with God because they're just thinking in terms of being told what to do. Now, being in the will of God requires that you go beyond that. Jesus told a story about a person who had a servant, and the servant was out in the field working. And when the servant came in, the master asked him to prepare a meal, and the servant would eat later. And he made a stunning statement there. He said, "You know, if your servant does what you tell him to do, you don't thank him." And he says, "So you likewise, if you only do what God tells you to do, say, 'We are unprofitable servants.'" Do you remember that? Think about it now. If you only do what you're told to do, you're an unprofitable servant. Who is a profitable servant? A profitable servant is someone who knows what needs to be done and does it without being told. Right? Now that fits in with Jesus' statement about "you are my friends because you know what I'm doing. I call you my friends because you understand what's going on." That's the picture of a co-worker, not of a servant who stands around waiting to be told what to do. Your wants and your desires are important in God's plan for you. And in general, in human relations also, things are beginning to be what they ought to be if you have people who don't need to be told. And I like to illustrate that, as I do in the book Hearing God, by talking about our children, John and Becky, and when they were small, if they were playing in the yard or getting into the peanut butter in the kitchen or whatever, they were certainly in our will, though we weren't telling them what to do. And that's crucial in coming to understand the nature of our friendship and intimate relationship with God. We are, of course, talking, listening. There are times when we're told what to do, and that's perfectly all right. That's a good thing. We should expect it when it's appropriate, and I believe that God will provide it. But we are not in the relationship of simply a master and slave. Not in that relationship. Now, interestingly, Paul and some of the other apostles call themselves slaves of Jesus Christ. But that slavery is on the other side of friendship. You've already gone through friendship to get to that kind of slavery. That is the kind of service that makes God's will and His purposes, what Christ is doing in the world, makes that primary, but it is not something that you're driven to, it is something you are drawn to. You are drawn to by the goodness and beauty of all that is in God and in His creation and in His world. And in that relationship, we experience complete service as free people under someone who respects our wants and our wills and refines them and helps us become the individuals that He wants us to be. You know, the only real individuals are saints. And when you get to know them, you find they're no two alike. Sinners are boringly similar. And it's so depressing to see that scene, predictable, because there's nothing of uniqueness in what they're living for. They're living for themselves. They're living for their wants without reference to God. They're enslaved to their desires, and the world has a hold of them and is pressing them into a mold. And they're all very, very, very similar. And all you have to do is watch a little television to see how similar they are. But the saints are unique because God has shaped their wants and their wills. As the Psalm 37 says, delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart. And I think there's a pleasing ambiguity in that phrase, because He actually does give you desires in the sense that He shapes your impulses, what you're ready to do, what you want, so that they match up with His. And that's where that saying I give you comes in, where I say that God is developing us. His intent for us is to come to the place to where He can empower us to do what we want. And then He works on the other side, the object of the desire, and gives us the desires because He's already given us the desires for what we desire. And so now then, that is a unique combination that makes every individual living in the conversation with God to be something no one else has ever seen.